Well, the Skotek brothers have always been very good with large-scale miniatures and creating a sort of reality on that level, and traditionally have not been very involved in doing a lot of composite work, although they're comfortable doing it. They always prefer to try to do it a little bit more in camera, and I saw that as being sort of a large-scale miniature proposition where we build these buildings and cars and just blow them away with air mortars and that sort of thing. But then there were a certain number of shots in the sequence that were clearly going to be composite shots, and so they were really the perfect choice because they got to, once again, you know, run the full spectrum of technique from computer-generated imagery of the collapsing buildings and the shockwave propagating across the city to just good old-fashioned run the cameras up to 120 frames and blow it up miniature photography.
We set about making this miniature. And the way we did it was we worked with several different scales. The front of this set were larger scale buildings that were in the range of a 16th scale. And as we went back further into the set, we got down to a 35th of a scale. In all, there were 6 or 7 buildings. You face the problem when you want to make a model that big of creating surfaces that have to support their own weight, and yet they have to be breakaway. One of the things that we saw very clearly from the nuclear blast footage of actual tests is that the concrete, the masonry, breaks up into millions of little pieces. So there's a heavy breaking. It isn't simply 2 or 3 breaks onto the surface. You have to disintegrate the matter. You have to practically vaporize it and blow it away. So we found a size that would work. We could create a kind of combination plaster and resin breakaway material that would support its own weight and yet be fragile enough that it would disintegrate when you'd hit it with air cannons and Ritter fans and that sort of thing. That was a major, major problem. We experimented with a lot of different things. We wound up taking plaster and mixing it in various densities to the point where you'd look at it and it would fall apart. Other times you'd hit it with a hammer and it'd break the hammer. It was a real crazy period of time because we're casting up these building facades and you would think, this is it, and we'd set it up and it would fall down before we'd shoot a test of it. And of course the guys on the crew were, you know, having to take tranquilizers because they're having to transport these breakaways from the platen where they were laid out and then put them vertical. And that was a nerve-wracking, very nerve-wracking experience. Now, keeping in mind that when you have buildings, normally in a miniature where nothing happens, they're just used for an establishing shot or something's flying between them, you don't see the insides. Well, here we had this huge problem that we had to build the insides of these buildings, at least in more than a perfunctory manner, if not in full detail, because when this blast comes, of course, they're ripping off the surface, and then you want to keep ripping off the inside and pushing back deeper and deeper into the structure. So we found ourselves having to come up with materials for the insides of the building that could be mass-produced and assembled crudely but visually effectively and simply. So we experimented with, again, for these interiors, all kinds of things. We had cardboard boxes that were augmented with matzo crackers. We found that matzo crackers were in the right scale for rooms. They had the little segment lines so we could break them up and glue them in, and they were cheap. They were a ready solution. They were like having little plaster breakaway sections easily available. So that became an item on the set, matzo crackers. We had balsa wood chunks, metal chunks, plaster pieces. We also found that various types of cereals like shredded wheat and cornflakes were spray painted because, again, that looks like broken masonry. That was all spray painted down and poured into the rooms inside of these buildings. So when we had the blast, the matzo would shatter, the cardboard supports would shatter, the plaster supports around that would shatter, and then all these crackers and cereal would blow away and it would look like shattered masonry. So all that, those ideas stem from the notion of where can you find off-the-shelf detail. And some of it was pretty silly, but it worked. Facing across from the buildings, miniature buildings about 9 feet away, was a row of air cannons and several Ritters and E-fans. These were spread out along the length of the entire miniature, delivering the force to the buildings. It was a pretty lethal looking combination. It got to be pretty frightening looking at all these air cannons lined up with their cones, and some of these cones were filled with debris and metal shrapnel. We actually packed them with metal shrapnel as well to help disintegrate the building facades. We used 9 air cannons in total, 5 of which we had custom built for the film. These each were delivering like 200 pounds of pressure. We had also had 2 Ritters with louvers set up to augment those in between the air cannons, and several E-fans. The thing that was very interesting to see is that once this blast would go off, after we did our first take, we'd see if there were any gaps in that coverage of wall of air coming across the shot, a building or a piece wouldn't go. And the one thing we couldn't have in the shot was 2 buildings blow away and the middle one kind of gets a little shot. We needed an even wall of pressure to take everything out. And that became, again, a huge problem of delivering a continuous solid wall of air into these models and then continuing that movement right on through the set and away and out of the frame. So we did quite a number of takes to achieve that. We found that very often we had 2 cannons aimed at a particular structure, and we'd find sometimes their own air currents would neutralize each other or bend the air around each other and leave a little section in the middle intact. So we had to do some experimenting to find out the best configuration of these cannons, and very often it was a matter of a ½ inch or an inch. Either way would make a big difference by the time that air got to the building. Even with all of that force, we found that these buildings would shatter and fall so far and then drop. The particles would drop. They wouldn't carry fully out of frame. So we found ourselves augmenting all of these air cannons, the Ritters, the E-fans, and airlines also, with upwards of 25 or 30 cables attached to the back of the set. These were wired into the structures that were holding up the breakaways. Those wires carried over to trapdoor drops that were weighted down with sandbags, and these were triggered by a computer. So what we had was on the fire cue or the blast cue, we had the air cannons go off, the Ritter louvers opened up, the airlines were triggered on, the E-fans were turned on, and at that same moment a computer tripped the drops on the sandbags, and all these wires also pulled the model apart internally to get this full disintegration and carry everything out of the shot. So it was quite a deal. It was like a giant machine. In addition to the breakaway miniature, we layered in several exposures of particles that were blown across the frame with an air cannon. These particles consisted of little bits and pieces, fuller's earth, some glitter, broken glass, that sort of thing. We also shot a miniature car that was matted into the shot, and several other elements of flying debris. We didn't actually use any fire in any of the shots. The scale would not have allowed us to put fire in those shots, and as it turned out, it's mostly flying debris. You don't actually see any fire occurring. We introduced a sense of fire coming up the surface of the buildings by tinting the smoke elements that we shot with a very rich red Hicon color element. There are 2 other shots in the sequence, the street level sequence. One is of a freeway and an exit ramp with a bus that gets blown away, and another is of a park, kind of a park area where we have trees that get blown over. Those 2 shots had to be shot in a mirror, because as it turned out, we had built the sets in full, and we're in the process of shooting these elements when the live action portion of this sequence had begun. So we went up to the location where Jim was shooting the very first shot, which is the playground, when the sequence begins on the playground. And because of the direction of the sun on that particular day, he approached us and he said, well, you know, it would work better if the sun was from the direction of lighting was from the right side of the picture and not the left. Can we key the rest of the sequence in this way? And we very nicely and politely said, oh yeah, we can do that. So we found ourselves, for the 2 existing sets that had been set up, shooting into a front surface mirror, and that made it a little more complicated, but we got through it. I'll say one of the things that we had to do shooting in the mirror for the freeway shot was to reverse all of the graphics, the freeway sign, the stop signs, the road signs. We also had to make the passenger side of the bus into a driver's side, rearrange the steering wheels on some of the cars and that sort of thing. So there were probably about 50 little details like that that had to be modified for that shot. In the scene of the park being blown away by the nuclear blast, we had very prominently in the foreground a stop sign. And this stop sign we had to make a mirrored image of. We laid it out in reverse, so when we shot in a front surface mirror, it was in the correct orientation. The reason we elected to shoot in a mirror was due to the fact that at that stage we were not planning on doing any opticals. We were not going to do any enhancements, and we felt if we could solve the problem on the set, then we would wind up with a better result. We felt we would have a purer, crisper image. As it turned out, most of those shots underwent further optical enhancement. So the kind of optical enhancements that occurred were after the fact changes. Jim wanted some fire on the trees, a little more smoke in the shot. What we discovered in going to opticals is that we got a grittier look, tougher and a more contrasty look, which is something we had talked about earlier on. We had discussed with Jim the possibility of degrading the image in some way, making it a little more contrasty, a little grittier. One, to affect the sense of the documentary footage, and two, to give it a slightly displaced quality that you would have in a nightmare. Those two qualities, I think, helped the sequence quite a bit. So the optical degradation actually worked in our favor. So we were in the city level street shots no longer avoiding the use of opticals. We were planning on enhancing them further with opticals.
Sometimes you can kill a picture with sound design if you go too hyperbolic and stylizing it. But there's a certain degree of stylization that if it's done on a subliminal level, can be very effective. We were working obviously with Gary Rydstrom's team up at Skywalker, and Gary had done a fabulous job on backdraft and giving a kind of personality to the fire and putting in a lot of animal noises and things like that into the flames. And that kind of approach where you're sort of doing what's obvious, but you're also working below that level on kind of subliminal messages that creates a weird energy or characterization to the scene, I think works very well. And then the rest of it is just about technical quality, keeping it as pristine as possible. The integration of sound effects and music is, I think, one of the hardest things in a big action picture. And Brad Fiedel, fortunately, had a lot of these things in mind. So he wrote music that wasn't overly embellished. It had a very strong percussion line. It had a strong melody line. There weren't a lot of counter melodies, and there was not a lot of Baroque detail that would get lost. He really went for a very visceral energy, which worked well with laying effects over it. But sometimes you just get into a big train wreck where you've got too much music and too much effects, and you have to decide on one or the other. And the other thing I believe strongly in is dynamic range. If everything is loud, eventually nothing is loud. So you really have to create those moments of quiet so that the loud stuff can have some impact without just becoming sort of numbing, ear-ringing stuff by the end of the film.